When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it buried not only homes and temples, but also secrets whispered behind locked doors. In the heart of Pompeii stood brothels whose painted walls still tell stories of desire, survival, and trade. Tonight, we step inside those hidden rooms, where history blushed and bargained in the shadows. There is a narrow street in Pompeii, paved with stones polished by centuries of footsteps, where shadows fall differently than in the rest of the city. The people who walked here, merchants, sailors, slaves, and citizens, often carried something heavier than their coin purses, secrets. The street led to a doorway, unremarkable at first glance, but within it lay a world that both fascinated and unsettled the ancient city, the lupanar, the brothel. Pompeii was no stranger to indulgence. Taverns spilled wine until the streets grew slippery with it. Courtyards echoed with laughter and music long after the sun had set. Yet within the brothel, life condensed into a single, startling truth: desire was a business, and the business was relentless. The walls, still preserved beneath ash and pumice, bear graffiti scratched by restless hands, some crude, some playful, some heartbreakingly human. Names were etched alongside boasts, complaints, or whispered prayers. To step into this space today is to step into the raw pulse of Roman life, stripped of its marble masks. The brothel was not merely a place of lust, but also of survival. Women, many enslaved, some displaced by war, others born into servitude, were sold into a life where their bodies were both their prison and their livelihood. The air must have been heavy with oil lamps, the musky smoke of cheap incense attempting to disguise sweat, wine, and longing. For the men who entered, it was an escape from the strictness of Roman order, a place where anonymity ruled. For the women, it was a place of endless performance, where their names were rarely remembered, but their bodies were. The mosaic frescoes on the walls, shockingly vivid, were not decorations but advertisements, images that spoke in the universal language of commerce and desire. And yet, under all this, there lingers a question that unsettles the modern mind: what did it mean to live a life measured not in years, but in transactions? To be immortalized not by your story, but by graffiti left behind by passing strangers? This is the story of Pompeii's brothel culture, a tale not of titillation, but of stark reality. A story that survived, ironically, because of tragedy. Inside the lupanar, the walls themselves seemed to breathe with memory. Painted above the doorways of the cramped rooms were frescoes unlike any temple mosaic or grand villa mural. These were not visions of gods, nor heroic battles, nor pastoral landscapes. They were direct, unflinching images of men and women in acts of intimacy, painted with a clarity that even today feels startling. Each fresco was, in essence, a menu. The brothel catered to a wide clientele, many of whom may not have spoken Latin fluently, sailors from distant ports, traders from across the sea. The images spoke for themselves, wordlessly advertising what was offered. It was a marketplace reduced to its most human form, with paint standing in for language. The rooms beneath these paintings were small, scarcely more than closets. A simple stone bed stood in each one, often covered with nothing more than a straw mattress. Light seeped in dimly from oil lamps, their flickering glow casting long shadows that turned painted lovers into restless ghosts. And yet, the art on the walls did something curious. It transformed what was essentially a bare, claustrophobic space into something of ritual. The images gave context, almost justification, as though what was happening inside was not merely transactional but part of a timeless, universal cycle. But the walls bore more than paintings. Scratched into the plaster were words, names, boasts, small confessions. I was here. I had her. She was kind. They blur the line between history and gossip, between memory and erasure. To stand in the lupanar today is to feel both presence and absence, the presence of lives so vividly marked, and the absence of their voices, forever silent beneath volcanic ash. To understand Pompeii's brothel is to understand the cost, not merely in coins, but in lives. The lupanar was not an equal place, nor a realm of shared pleasure. It was a site of transaction, where the currency of intimacy was weighed against power, poverty, and survival. A visit here did not cost much compared to other Roman indulgences. For a single denarius, sometimes less, a man could purchase what others might spend on a loaf of bread or a jug of rough wine. The affordability tells its own story. Brothels were not designed for the elite, who often had slaves to fulfill their desires in private villas. Rather, these were spaces for soldiers returning from campaign, sailors with salt still in their hair, merchants looking for a momentary escape before resuming their trade. But for those who worked within these walls, the arithmetic was cruel. Many were enslaved, their earnings flowing not into their own hands but into those of their owners. For some, freedom was a distant dream, a sum they might try to buy with years of toil. For others, there was no such hope, only repetition, a cycle as endless as the graffiti carved into the plaster. The act itself was brief, yet the toll was lasting. Disease stalked these rooms, hunger pressed in at the edges, and the vulnerability of being both seen and unseen weighed heavily. The frescoes painted a facade of endless choice, but behind them were lives constrained to the narrow width of a stone bed. And yet, there was resilience too. Some women and men left their names behind, etched in playful boasts or in complaints about stingy clients. Some mocked the visitors with wit sharper than any blade, while others carved symbols of affection, small marks of humanity left amid the trade. In these scratches of language, we glimpsed not faceless workers, but individuals who insisted on being remembered, even if only in a single hurried line. Thus, the cost of Pompeii's brothel culture was layered. Coins exchanged for flesh, yes, but also the erosion of time, freedom, and dignity. And yet, through painted walls and etched words, a stubborn trace of humanity remains, refusing to vanish even beneath the ash. Imagine the scene as the lamps were lit in Pompeii's lupanar. Oil lamps, their light unsteady, cast wavering shadows against painted walls where gods, lovers, and fantasies lived in eternal embrace. The air was close, heavy with the mingling scents of oil, sweat, cheap wine, and the faint tang of incense burning to mask less pleasant odors. A visitor stepped inside, coins clinking in his pouch. He might pause beneath the frescoes, glancing upward at the painted scenes that doubled as a menu. Each fresco depicted a position, a possibility, a promise, silent negotiations before words were even spoken. The walls were alive with suggestion, guiding the imagination and perhaps helping those with little Latin to communicate their desires. He would move to a narrow doorway, where a woman or man sat waiting. They were not adorned in jewels or silks but in simple tunics, their hair oiled, their faces framed by lamplight. Their smiles were practiced, welcoming but careful, crafted to ease the tension of strangers. The exchange was swift, a coin, a gesture, a nod. The visitor stepped into one of the small cubicula, each with its rough stone bed topped by a straw mattress. The room was barely wide enough for two, its ceiling low, its fresco above the bed a reminder of what was expected. The act itself was often hurried, punctuated by the sounds of laughter, coughs, or footsteps from the other rooms. Privacy was scarce. What mattered was efficiency, not romance. For the visitor, this was a brief indulgence. For the worker, it was another notch in the day, another client in a long line. Outside, voices carried from the street, a reminder that life in Pompeii never paused, not even in these shadowed rooms where bodies met in commerce. And when the man departed, pulling his cloak about him, the worker remained in the narrow space, waiting for the next knock. Some passed the time by scratching words into the plaster, names, jokes, little fragments of themselves that time could not erase. This was a night in the lupanar, not scandalous, but ordinary. A routine so woven into Pompeii's daily rhythm that it hardly shocked its citizens. Only to us, staring centuries later at these walls preserved by fire and ash, does it feel like a whisper of something forbidden. To understand Pompeii's brothel culture, we must step into the wider world of Roman morality, a world full of contradictions. On one hand, Roman society tolerated, even expected, the existence of prostitution. On the other, those who practiced it were branded with permanent shame. Respectable Roman citizens drew a sharp line between honestiores, the honorable, and infames, the dishonored. Prostitutes, along with gladiators, actors, and certain entertainers, belonged to this category of the disgraced. They could never hold public office, never testify in court, and their word carried little weight. The Roman law, cold and clinical, stripped them of certain protections other free citizens enjoyed. Yet the hypocrisy is striking. Roman men could freely visit brothels, and it was no secret that they did so. The stain of dishonor clung only to the worker, not the client. Wives, meanwhile, were expected to embody chastity and loyalty, existing in stark contrast to the women who sold pleasure in Pompeii's narrow lupanar. The contrast between ideals and realities was immense. Rome publicly celebrated virtues like pudicitia, female modesty, and gravitas, dignity. Statues of noble matrons graced city squares, temples honored goddesses of purity. Yet a few streets away, coins exchanged hands for sex, and walls whispered with graffiti about who had visited whom. Moralists like Seneca and later Christian writers thundered against this system, but most ordinary Romans saw it as part of the natural order. Just as slaves were expected to serve without question, prostitutes existed to absorb desires deemed inappropriate for wives or daughters. The arrangement was tolerated because it was convenient. But for those trapped within it, the consequences were lifelong. A free woman who had once worked in a brothel could never truly escape the label. Her body, once entered into commerce, was forever tied to infamy. Even her children might feel the shadow of that stain, no matter how far she tried to climb from it. So here lay the great paradox. Pompeii's brothels were neither secret nor scandalous, yet they stood as a reminder of the rigid divide between who could claim honor and who was condemned to live outside it. The moral double standard kept Pompeii's lupanar busy, its frescoes painted, its beds occupied, day after day, while Roman society turned its face away, pretending it was all neatly contained within stone walls. Step inside the narrow chambers of Pompeii's lupanar, and you will find not just frescoes, but voices, etched into the plaster in rough handwriting. The graffiti left behind by both clients and workers tells us more than any historian's scroll could, because it carries raw, unpolished honesty. Some inscriptions were boasts, carved by men eager to leave behind proof of their conquest. One scroll reads, "I had a good time here with Restituta." Another brags, "Felix screwed here well." These crude lines may sound almost humorous to us today, but in their time, they were statements of virility, small monuments to pleasure carved into stone. Other writings are more intimate, even vulnerable. One man confessed, "I love Sabina." Another pleaded, "Successus loves Iris, she does not return his affection." In these fleeting scratches of Latin, we glimpse heartbreak, jealousy, longing, emotions as timeless as the trade itself. Workers, too, sometimes left their marks. Some wrote their names, perhaps to assert identity in a profession that stripped them of it. Others may have encouraged clients to remember them specifically, leaving traces of individuality in an otherwise impersonal economy. Together, the graffiti turned the lupanar into something more than a brothel. It became a diary of desire, a ledger of passion, laughter, and despair. Imagine lying on a straw mattress in one of the tiny rooms, looking up at words carved by men who came before you, reminders that you were part of a long chain of longing, no more unique than those who had passed through before. This graffiti is also startlingly democratic. It records not the polished histories of senators or generals, but the voices of ordinary men and women, the ones history usually forgets. It is the chatter of Pompeii's streets, the echoes of its nightlife, the whispers scratched into plaster before the ash fell. And then, in 79 C, Vesuvius erupted. These voices were sealed in time, preserved in their vulgarity, their tenderness, their humor. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered them, and the world got a glimpse not of Rome's grandeur, but of its most human contradictions. Pompeii's graffiti reminds us, history is not just written in marble, but in casual scratches on the wall, where desire and despair stand side by side. In the dim corridors of Pompeii's lupanar, pleasure was a business, and like any business, it had its price. Archaeologists have uncovered graffiti that listed not just names and boasts, but also fees, tiny fragments of Pompeii's erotic economy. A man might spend just 1 to 2 denarii for a quick encounter, the rough equivalent of a day's wages for a common laborer. To put it in perspective, that was about the price of a loaf of good bread and a jug of cheap wine. In other words, for some, visiting the brothel was no more extravagant than stopping at the tavern. But prices varied. Wealthier patrons could spend more, sometimes 5 or 10 denarii, to secure privacy, longer time, or a more sought-after companion. Some brothels even appear to have had tiers of service, with different rooms and frescoes suggesting more expensive offerings for those with fuller purses. It is important to remember, though, that these denarii rarely went into the pockets of the workers themselves. Most prostitutes in Pompeii were enslaved or deeply indebted. Their earnings flowed upward, to brothel keepers, pimps, or owners, who controlled the establishment. The workers received little beyond food, shelter, and perhaps meager tips slipped to them in secret. And yet, the exchange of money in these dimly lit rooms was more than economic, it was symbolic. For the men of Pompeii, to pay for pleasure was to exert control, to purchase not just physical release but the illusion of power. For the women and men working within, that same coin was a reminder of their lack of freedom, their bodies turned into currency. Still, brothels were not the only option. Street prostitutes worked in alleys, taverns, and bathhouses, often charging less than their counterparts in the lupanar. Wealthier courtesans, meanwhile, could operate independently, setting their own rates and sometimes wielding influence over their lovers. This entire hierarchy created a strange reflection of Roman society itself, layered, unequal, transactional. When we picture Pompeii's brothels today, we might imagine luxury, sensuality, or decadence. But the truth is grimmer. For the workers, it was survival. For the patrons, it was convenience. And for us, centuries later, it is a reminder that behind the frescoes of gods and lovers were real people, whose bodies were bought and sold for the price of bread and wine. To the Roman mind, sex was never just physical. It lived in a world interwoven with the divine. Step into Pompeii's brothel, and you'd find not just erotic frescoes but subtle nods to gods who presided over fertility, fortune, and fate. The line between sacred ritual and earthly desire was never as sharp as we might expect today. The god most often invoked was Venus, patroness of love, beauty, and sensuality. Pompeii, after all, proudly called itself Venus Pompeiana's city, and her temple stood not far from the marketplace and the brothels. Patrons might whisper a prayer to Venus before entering, asking not only for pleasure but also for virility. A successful visit, in their minds, was as much the goddess's blessing as it was their own doing. Then there was Priapus, the rustic fertility god whose exaggerated statue once stood in the doorway of a Pompeian home, weighing his enormous member against a bag of gold. He was a reminder of prosperity tied to virility, a warning that sexuality itself was a form of wealth. Priapus was often painted on walls or carved onto charms hung in bedrooms and taverns, meant to ward off the evil eye and guarantee abundance. Even Mercury, god of commerce and thieves, had a place in the lupanar. Every transaction within those narrow rooms was his domain, coins exchanged, deals made, power exercised. To the Romans, sex was a trade, and so Mercury's shadow lingered, a silent overseer of profit and loss. But perhaps most striking is how fertility and sex were woven into festivals. During the Floralia, an April celebration in honor of the goddess Flora, prostitutes were sometimes encouraged, or compelled, to take part in public games. They performed dances, sang ribald songs, and even staged mock chases of erotic theater. This blending of sacred festival and sexual display tells us something crucial. The Romans did not wall off desire from the divine. They placed it squarely within it. So when a man walked into a Pompeian brothel after sunset, he may not have thought he was entering a place of sin. Instead, he was stepping into a world where his most private desires were sanctioned by tradition, business, and, in a strange way, by the gods themselves. The frescoes on the walls were not only instructions for pleasure but invocations of divine presence, ensuring that even lust carried the faint echo of ritual. The irony is that, centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered these spaces, they often tried to hide them away, locking erotic frescoes in the secret cabinet of Naples, as though to shield the modern world from ancient shamelessness. But for Pompeii, there was no shame, only continuity, sex, money, and worship, all under one painted roof. If we strip away the frescoes and the mythic glow of Venus, what remains is the flesh and blood reality of the women who lived and worked inside Pompeii's lupanar. Their lives were far from the glamour suggested by the erotic art. They were workers in the most literal sense, their days shaped by routine, exhaustion, and the constant calculation of survival. A typical day began early. Though the lupanar would draw most of its traffic in the afternoons and evenings, prostitutes often spent the morning preparing themselves. Some bathed, if water and time allowed, in communal baths nearby, not just for cleanliness but because appearance was currency. Simple perfumes, oils, and jewelry were their tools of allure, bought cheaply from traders or gifted by clients. For women who owned little, even a painted bronze bangle could serve as a professional investment. The rooms of the lupanar were tiny, bare stone cubicles just big enough for a bed of straw or a thin mattress. Archaeologists found remnants of small oil lamps, used to dimly light the chamber during encounters. Privacy was scarce. Thin walls let sounds leak through, so moans, laughter, and whispered bargains carried down the narrow hallways. Meals were meager. Many prostitutes relied on the taverns attached to brothels, eating bread, olives, figs, or whatever leftovers could be bartered for with favors. In some cases, the brothel owner provided food as part of the arrangement, an incentive to keep women working. Alcohol, especially cheap wine, was common, both as a way to dull the edge of fatigue and to keep clients loosened for business. But it wasn't all monotony. The lupanar was also a crossroads of gossip and news. Prostitutes often became the secret keepers of Pompeii, privy to whispers about politics, trade, or forbidden affairs. Some clients confided more than they should, treating their time not just as physical release but as a chance to unburden themselves. In that sense, the women became unwilling confidants of the city's inner workings. Of course, the risks were enormous. Disease was a constant specter. Medical knowledge existed, but treatment was rudimentary. Ointments of herbs, wine, or honey, often ineffective against infections. Violence, too, lurked close. Though Roman law technically protected prostitutes as citizens or slaves, enforcement was uneven. A drunk or aggressive client could leave bruises behind, and there was little recourse beyond hoping the brothel keeper intervened. And yet, despite the hardships, there were moments of agency. Some women saved money, enough to buy finer clothes or even, in rare cases, their freedom. A handful transitioned into tavern owners, performers, or courtesans who entertained wealthier clients. These stories were exceptions, but they reveal a layer of resilience, lives shaped not just by exploitation but also by strategies of endurance. In the end, the prostitutes of Pompeii were neither entirely powerless nor truly free. They lived in the margins, serving as both objects of desire and indispensable laborers in a society where sex was commerce. Their world was painted in vibrant colors on the walls above their heads, but their daily reality was made of stone beds, dim oil lamps, and the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing down the lupanar's hall. Not all prostitutes in Rome lived the life of the women trapped in Pompeii's cramped lupanar. Across the empire, prostitution existed on a spectrum, from the cheap and transactional to the refined and theatrical. On one end were the brothel workers, largely slaves or freed women, surviving on the coins of strangers. On the other end were courtesans, entertainers, and hetairai who mingled with senators, merchants, and even emperors. The difference was not only economic but social. Courtesans, sometimes called meretrices honesti, operated outside the dingy confines of a lupanar. They worked in taverns, bathhouses, theaters, or even their own private apartments. Some were trained in music, poetry, and dance, and their services extended beyond the bedroom. They could hold conversations about politics, recite verse, and flatter wealthy men into parting with far more than the price of a quick encounter. For these women, allure was a performance, carefully staged. The scale of payment reveals the gulf. A brothel worker might charge a single coin, a bronze, as the price of a cup of cheap wine. A courtesan, however, might demand several denarii in silver for an evening, a sum equivalent to a soldier's wages for days of service. For the richest courtesans, gifts were common: fine garments, jewelry, even slaves or property. Their clients were not random passers-by but repeat patrons who cultivated ongoing relationships. Yet the glamour of courtesans should not be overstated. Their status was fragile. They might enjoy wealth and influence for a season, but reputation was fickle. If abandoned by patrons or displaced by younger rivals, they could slip back into poverty quickly. Unlike respectable Roman matrons, courtesans had no legal protections in marriage, inheritance, or citizenship. Their beauty and wit were their only safeguards, and time eroded both. Still, compared to the lives of Pompeii's brothel workers, theirs was a different universe. The lupanar prostitute faced long hours in a dark room, with little control over her clientele. The courtesan, though still part of a stigmatized profession, at least shaped her path with some autonomy. In Roman satire and poetry, courtesans appear as witty, sharp-tongued figures, sparring verbally with their lovers, often portrayed as clever manipulators who could twist the desires of powerful men to their own advantage. The contrast speaks to Rome's broader obsession with hierarchy. Even in sex, there was rank. To climb the ladder of intimacy required not just beauty but strategy, charm, and an almost theatrical sense of survival. The courtesan might sit at a banquet table beside a senator, drinking imported wine, while the brothel worker in Pompeii huddled on a straw mattress, waiting for another knock on the door. Both, however, were united by one truth: their bodies were coin, and in a society that celebrated Venus but punished women for stepping outside strict respectability, they existed in a liminal space, desirable, useful, but never fully accepted. Rome was not a city that left much to chance, and even in the shadowy trade of prostitution, the hand of the state reached in. Unlike some cultures that pretended such work did not exist, the Romans accepted it as a part of life. Their approach was not to eliminate prostitution but to manage, regulate, and above all, tax it. By the reign of Augustus, the same emperor who promoted a vision of moral reform and family values, the state had introduced laws that directly addressed prostitutes. Women who entered the profession were required to register with the city's aediles, magistrates who oversaw public morals, marketplaces, and infrastructure. This registration stripped them of any claim to the respectability of Roman matrons. Once listed, a woman could not later marry into the elite or claim the privileges of honorable citizenship. In the eyes of the law, the stain was permanent. The state, however, saw no contradiction in profiting from the very thing it condemned. Prostitutes, brothel owners, and sometimes even courtesans were subject to special taxes. In later centuries, under the Empire, this could take the form of a vectigal ex capturis, a levy on the earnings of sex workers. For Rome, prostitution was simultaneously shameful and lucrative, a contradiction the treasury was all too willing to embrace. Legal restrictions shaped the lives of these women. They were barred from wearing the stola, the garment of respectable wives, and instead were often expected to wear a toga, the clothing of men or disgraced women, visually marking them as outsiders. They had no recourse if cheated by clients, for the law regarded their contracts as inherently dishonorable. In disputes, the word of a prostitute carried little weight. Yet the law's attempt to mark prostitutes as other never fully worked. Demand ensured their presence in every corner of Roman society, from the docks and taverns to the villas of the wealthy. The state might brand them with legal disgrace, but the same senators who passed those laws could often be found slipping into a brothel or maintaining a mistress. Roman satirists loved to mock this hypocrisy, men who condemned prostitutes in the Senate by day and sought them out at night. In Pompeii, the lupanar's existence was itself a sign of this uneasy tolerance. Authorities knew exactly where the brothel was and allowed it to function, provided it stayed in its place, out of sight of temples, away from the central forum, tucked into a discreet corner of the city. Regulation, not abolition, was the rule. Thus, prostitution in Rome lived in a strange twilight. The law sought to degrade those who practiced it, stripping them of honor, yet the empire itself relied on their trade for revenue and for the unspoken service of channeling desire away from the wives and daughters of respectable households. For the prostitute in Pompeii's lupanar, the law was not a shield but a brand, marking her permanently, even as it quietly ensured her existence was both inevitable and profitable. In Pompeii, the line between sacred ritual and earthly desire blurred more easily than one might expect. This was, after all, a city that lived under the gaze of Venus. She was not merely a goddess of beauty and love, but the patroness of Pompeii itself, whose official title was Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum, the colony of Venus Pompeiana. Shrines, statues, and paintings of the goddess adorned the city, her figure a constant reminder that love, fertility, and sensual pleasure were woven into divine favor. It would be tempting to think of brothels as existing in open opposition to such religious ideals, but in Pompeii, and in Rome more broadly, the two spheres often coexisted. Temples to Venus sometimes stood near places where prostitution thrived, and rituals associated with fertility festivals blurred into acts of carnality. Certain prostitutes, especially higher-ranking courtesans, even styled themselves as living votaries of the goddess, claiming that their work was an extension of Venus's influence in the mortal world. Archaeologists studying Pompeii have found small amulets, figurines, and even graffiti that seem to draw this connection. A carved phallus might be set above a doorway, not simply as a crude joke, but as a symbol of fertility and divine protection. In Roman culture, sexuality was not hidden behind the same moral curtain as in later centuries. To display an image of male or female anatomy could be apotropaic, warding off evil spirits and misfortune. In this sense, the walls of the lupanar were not just decorated for titillation. they were also guarded by charms of power. Even the act of prostitution itself could be seen through a religious lens. Some scholars suggest that in earlier Italic traditions, echoes of ritual prostitution, practices where women offered themselves in temples as a form of sacred devotion, lingered faintly in Roman attitudes. While by the time of Pompeii this had faded into cultural memory, the idea that sex was connected to the favor of the gods had not vanished entirely. To buy time with a prostitute might not have been thought of as pious, but neither was it considered wholly divorced from the sphere of the divine. And then, there was the paradox of Venus Pompeiana. She was adored in public festivals, honored with offerings of wine, perfume, and garlands, yet her name was also whispered in the lupanar, invoked by men in moments of private indulgence. For the women who worked in Pompeii's brothel, Venus was at once a protector and a cruel reminder, the goddess of love and beauty, presiding over a trade where love was sold and beauty was measured in coin. When Vesuvius erupted, the lupanar and the temple of Venus alike were buried in the same ash. Side by side, they were preserved for history as two faces of the same coin, the sacred and the profane, the divine and the desperate, bound together in the rhythms of Pompeian life. To walk the streets of Pompeii was to move through a city where commerce and carnality intermingled without shame. The brothel was not a hidden den at the edge of town. It was a business embedded into the city's economy, connected to taverns, baths, and bakeries as naturally as any workshop or wine shop. Many brothels stood near taverns, no accident at all. A patron would drink heavily, loosen his purse strings, and then, guided by a painted phallus carved into a wall, stumble a few steps into the lupanar. Wine and desire were business partners. Archaeologists have noted how food counters, thermopolia, were often located close to such houses, making them part of a tightly knit commercial district. For the women inside, the flow of customers was fueled as much by cheap jugs of wine as by the reputation of the establishment itself. The city's baths played a role as well. Romans treated bathing as both a hygienic routine and a social event, but the baths also primed the body. A man might soak in warm pools, have his muscles oiled, and then, in a state of relaxed indulgence, seek further satisfaction at the brothel nearby. Some bathhouses even had their own private rooms for paid encounters, blurring the boundary between civic leisure and commercial sex. The economic ties ran deeper than proximity. Prostitutes themselves needed supplies, cosmetics for painting the face, perfume to mask the odors of cramped rooms, simple clothing to replace what wore out. Merchants profited from this demand, and landlords earned steady rent from brothel owners. Even the city's tax collectors benefited. Prostitution, though stigmatized in reputation, was legal and taxable. Each woman's earnings were, in a sense, part of the empire's revenue stream. In Pompeii, graffiti paints a vivid picture of this economy at work. One tavern wall boasts of the best wine to loosen tongues and legs, while another scribble promises that, at Felix's house, the girls are cheap. Such lines are not random. They reveal a culture where brothel advertising was woven into public chatter, not unlike a painted sign for bread or wine. And then there were the patrons themselves, soldiers on leave, sailors spending their coin before returning to sea, merchants celebrating a sale, slaves desperate for one taste of control in a life otherwise bound by servitude. Each one left behind a coin, a fragment of voice and graffiti, or nothing but a faint trace in the city's economic records. The brothel was not just a private vice, it was a business network, a pulse within Pompeii's commercial life. If you stood outside the lupanar on a busy evening, you might hear laughter spilling from the tavern next door, smell roasted bread from a nearby bakery, and see men filing out of the baths. It was a seamless web of appetite, food, drink, warmth, and flesh, woven into the rhythm of an ordinary Pompeian night. If Pompeii's lupanar was a stage, the women inside were both its performers and its prisoners. Their voices, though muffled by time, echo faintly through the walls of graffiti, names, and fragments that survived the eruption. These women, so often reduced to anonymous figures in history, left behind more than the stone beds on which they worked. They left traces of selfhood, bold, cheeky, weary, and sometimes proud. The brothel's walls preserved their marks. One woman carved her name, Myrtis, next to a crude sketch of a man. Another, Crisis, declared herself the delight of many. These were not advertisements. They were inscriptions of existence, proof that they lived, labored, and refused to be erased. One graffito reads, "I am yours for 2 asses." Another, more playful, "Meth says, here I please men." In these brief lines, a voice emerges, not silent, not ashamed, but asserting presence. But for every name etched into plaster, there were dozens unrecorded. Most women in the lupanar were slaves. Their identities, their true birth names, and the languages of their childhood homes were often stripped away. They were renamed in Greek or Latin, given stage names that emphasized beauty, Leda, Flora, Daphne. Exotic sounding, they created a kind of theater for the customer, masking the reality of bondage beneath a costume of allure. Archaeologists believe many came from the eastern provinces, Greece, Syria, Thrace, captives of war or the slave trade. Others may have been local, sold into the system by debt or desperation. For them, the brothel was not a career but a fate. They lived above or behind the rooms in cramped spaces, their existence bound to the rhythm of men's comings and goings. Yet, within this bleak reality, we glimpse resilience. Graffiti left by women sometimes mocks their customers. "Athenais screwed here, but only once, because he paid badly." Such words carry a spark of agency, a small reclaiming of power through ridicule. In a world where the customer's coin dictated everything, humor became a weapon, and graffiti a diary written in plaster. They were young, often very young. Their work began as soon as their bodies were deemed marketable, and their careers often ended in illness, exhaustion, or early death. Yet the graffiti reveals they were not merely passive victims. They joked, advertised themselves, insulted men, and carved their names into eternity. When Vesuvius erupted, some may have been working as the ash cloud darkened the sky. Did they run from their tiny cells, jostling alongside the men who had been their customers moments before? Or were some trapped inside, entombed where they had labored? The eruption froze Pompeii in time, but it also froze the last traces of their voices. To walk through the lupanar today is to step into their shadow. Each stone bed whispers of a woman who once laughed, cursed, or cried there. Each graffito is a reminder that even in bondage, they carved themselves into history. They were not faceless. They were Myrtis, Crisis, Meth, Athenais, and countless others whose names remain lost but whose presence lingers in the walls of Pompeii. Pompeii's lupanar existed at the uneasy crossroads of indulgence and disdain. On the one hand, brothels were accepted, even necessary, institutions in Roman society. They were taxed, regulated, and often frequented by men of all classes. On the other hand, the women within them were marked with stigma so deep that it clung to them even in death. In the Roman world, sexuality itself was not condemned. Pleasure was celebrated in poetry, mosaics, and myth. A respectable Roman man could visit a prostitute without social ruin. Indeed, a lupanar was sometimes seen as a place where one could indulge without disturbing the sanctity of marriage. The legal system even acknowledged this. Wives had little recourse against husbands who sought pleasure outside the home. But while the customer retained his dignity, the prostitute carried a permanent scar of dishonor. Roman law classified them as infames, a legal category reserved for those stripped of civic respectability. Gladiators, actors, and prostitutes shared this status, united by their role as public performers of bodily labor. For the women of Pompeii's brothels, this meant exclusion from rights, protections, and honor. They could not marry citizens legally, testify in court, or reclaim a respectable life. Yet paradoxically, these women were also essential. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. Graffiti from Pompeii shows customers boasting about their conquests, comparing experiences, and even recommending certain women by name, as if they were local celebrities. One man scrawled, "I had a good time with Sabina here, she's worth the coin." Such remarks, crude though they are, testify to the women's notoriety. Still, the respect given to their services did not extend to their persons. They were tolerated but never honored. A man might laugh about his visit to the lupanar over wine, but he would never invite one of its women to dine at his table. She could be the source of his pleasure, but never of his prestige. The social contradiction is stark. Roman art and literature often celebrated eroticism with open delight, but the flesh-and-blood women who embodied that eroticism lived on the margins. They were vessels for desire, yet burdened with shame. Customers came to them for escape, but society never let them escape the brand of prostitution. In Pompeii, the duality was everywhere. The brothel stood near the bustling forum, in full view of public life, and yet the women inside lived in cramped, hidden quarters. They were central to the town's economy, yet excluded from its honor. They were remembered in graffiti, but denied dignity in the law. And so, their lives became a paradox, visible yet invisible, essential yet reviled. The stones of the lupanar still bear witness to this contradiction. They remind us that pleasure and stigma have long been intertwined, that societies may consume what they shame, and shame what they consume. On the morning of August 24, 79 C, the lupanar opened its doors as it had countless times before. The air was heavy with late summer heat, and the narrow street outside bustled with traders, slaves, and citizens rushing through their routines. No one knew that within hours, Mount Vesuvius would shatter everything. Inside the brothel, the rhythms of daily life likely carried on as usual. A customer bargaining over coin, a woman adjusting her hair in a bronze mirror, a barkeep fetching watered wine from the kitchen. Perhaps some laughter echoed in the stone halls, carried by the murals of gods and lovers that had watched over such moments for decades. Then, the earth began to tremble. At first, it may have felt like an ordinary quake, not unusual in a land where the ground often shook. But soon ash began to drift from the sky, gray dust settling on the tiled roof, drifting into the narrow courtyard. Customers and women may have stepped outside, looking upward, their faces marked with unease. The eruption escalated with terrifying speed. Darkness fell by mid-afternoon, a choking black cloud descending on Pompeii. The lupanar, with its small, cramped rooms, would have quickly filled with ash and falling debris. Some may have fled into the streets, running with the crowd, clutching only what they could carry. Others may have sought shelter inside, believing the stone walls might protect them. Archaeologists have debated the fate of the brothel's inhabitants. No bodies have been found within the lupanar itself. Perhaps they escaped in those first desperate hours, swallowed instead by the chaos outside. Or perhaps their remains were lost under layers of ash still unexcavated. What is certain is that their voices vanished that day, silenced alongside thousands of others. The graffiti, the frescoes, the coins scattered across the stone floor, all froze in time beneath the volcanic rain. The laughter, the whispers, the deals struck in hurried tones, all ended in a silence thicker than ash. Where once men bargained for pleasure, and women carried the weight of stigma, only darkness remained. For nearly 1,700 years, the lupanar lay hidden, sealed in its final moment. When it was unearthed in the 19th century, the world looked upon its murals and graffiti with curiosity, scandal, and fascination. The people themselves, however, the women who worked there, the men who visited, remained faceless, lost to time. The brothel's end was not a dramatic collapse, but an erasure. One moment, it was alive with human desires and contradictions. The next, it was entombed in silence. The women who had lived in the paradox of being both central and scorned disappeared without farewell, leaving behind only stone walls that whispered their story. The lupanar of Pompeii stands today as both ruin and revelation. A reminder that beneath the ash, there were people, laughing, fearing, bargaining, surviving, until survival itself was taken from them. When visitors step into the lupanar today, they see more than just faded frescoes and graffiti. They are stepping into the residue of human longing, captured at its most vulnerable. Here, painted on stone, are the imprints of desire, commerce, shame, and survival, intertwined in ways as old as civilization itself. The brothel was never only about pleasure. It was about control, power, and inequality. The women of Pompeii's lupanar were not courtesans weaving political webs in gilded palaces. They were enslaved or marginalized women, compelled to sell not only their bodies but also the illusion of intimacy. Their laughter, whether genuine or forced, was part of a performance that echoed endlessly in those cramped stone rooms. And yet there is something hauntingly human that survives in the graffiti they, or their clients, scratched into the walls. Names, crude boasts, promises of love, confessions of jealousy. Each phrase is a heartbeat frozen in plaster. Each sketch of desire, a fleeting attempt to mark existence in a world where memory could vanish as quickly as a coin slipped into a palm. The eruption of Vesuvius did not just bury their brothel, it equalized them with senators, merchants, and noble families. Ash does not distinguish between marble villas and narrow alleys, between temples and taverns, between a woman mocked for her trade and a man exalted for his rank. In death, Pompeii's hierarchy dissolved, and all were cast together into silence. Perhaps that is why the brothel fascinates us still. It reminds us that history is not only written by emperors and generals but by the anonymous, the forgotten, the voices without names. It tells us that desire, however it is judged, was part of their world, as it is part of ours. To walk through the lupanar today is to feel both distance and closeness. Distance because their lives were shaped by a culture and a morality so different from ours. Closeness because their laughter, their whispers, their graffiti feel startlingly modern, almost as if they knew someone, someday, would read them again. And in the end, Pompeii's brothel is not just about sex or scandal, it is about humanity. About the strange intersections of power and vulnerability, of survival and longing, of memory and forgetting. The lupanar whispers to us across centuries, reminding us that people lived, desired, struggled, and dreamed there, until the ash fell and all became quiet. The silence remains, but the whispers endure. And so, we close the shutters on Pompeii's lupanar, leaving its frescoes to fade once more into the dim glow of lamplight and memory. The voices that once filled those stone corridors, men bargaining, women laughing, whispers pressed against walls, have long since fallen silent. Yet silence, as history teaches us, is never empty. It is full of echoes. In the soft hush of evening, the brothel becomes less a place of scandal and more a reminder of how fragile and fleeting our lives truly are. The coins spent, the passions kindled, the jealousies scratched into plaster, all were swallowed in an instant by Vesuvius's ash. And yet 2,000 years later, we still lean in, curious, wondering, almost listening, as if the walls might speak again. This is the gift of Pompeii. It does not allow us to forget that history belongs not only to emperors, generals, or marble statues, but also to the anonymous, the vulnerable, and the voices we were never meant to hear. The lupanar, in its own quiet way, gives them back to us. Thank you for wandering through this strange corner of history with me tonight. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close and drift into dreams, where perhaps Pompeii's streets still bustle, lanterns glow against painted walls, and the voices of the past walk alongside us once more. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and remember, history whispers most loudly when the world is quiet.